Okay, and we're live, and today I just want to do a short video touching on the death of the leader of ISIS, Mr. Baghdadi. And one of the interesting things about ISIS was the media, particularly the Western media, but also Islamic apologists and basically everyone who wants to downplay the role of violence and coercion in Islam went to great effort to say that ISIS was not Islamic. Just like when Al Qaeda became front page news after the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, and subsequent to that, the bombing of the USS Cole, and ultimately the destruction of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon. We had the president come out and say that Islam is a religion of peace, and he even attended these interfaith services with imams, some of whom were linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. And for those of you who remember, Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni man who was a part of Al Qaeda and who became the subject of a huge manhunt after he left the United States after being interviewed by the FBI. He was put forward as a role model, as an example of moderate Islam and how Islam could be accommodated, and how the people who were skeptical of Islam, like Robert Spencer and Pam Geller and Stephen Emerson, how these people were simply fanning the flames of hysteria and they were Islamophobes. Well, very shortly thereafter, he became the head of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the head of one of the largest offshoots of Al Qaeda, responsible for numerous terrorist attacks and numerous unsuccessful attempts at inflicting terror, including an attempt to destroy an international flight with bombs secreted into the cargo hold of the plane, and he was eventually killed in a drone attack. He and his son, in a very later on in a very controversial strike by President Obama. But the point is, this was a man extolled as the great moderate face of Islam after 9/11. At the same time as he was planning to unleash havoc and and murder potentially hundreds of American citizens. And this is the problem with our elites cosseting of Islam. They're simply lying to you about the inherent nature of this religion. And the death of Baghdadi is a great illustration of this, because just like with Al Qaeda, we were repeatedly told that ISIS is not Islamic, despite the fact that it literally is called the Islamic State of ISIL, or ISIS, the Islamic State of the Levant and Shams. So it has Islam at the very center of its, at the very core of its being, and it is rooted on the precepts of the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah. The actions and the sayings of Muhammad bear a striking parallel to those of ISIS and Al Qaeda. There was nothing, and I would challenge the people who think that ISIS. I would challenge the people who think that ISIS is not Islamic to point to one of the more heinous, horrific actions that they've undertaken that contradicts the Quran, or better yet, point to an action that they did that Muhammad did not do, putting aside the al- allowance for technological innovation. Of course, Muhammad did not have Kalashnikovs. He didn't. He wouldn't be able to turn. He wouldn't be able to turn airplanes into precision guided missiles because they didn't exist at the time. So, making an allowance for technological innovations, what did Muhammad not do that ISIS does? That 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 you single them out for criticism? Hi, Mary. Yeah, it's true. Muslims do like to buy up a lot of property. They're actually doing this in Las Vegas, and it was kind of interesting. There was an article about this. They didn't mention the fact that this was the Nation of Islam. They were actually buying up strips of land in Las Vegas, but they do that here too in Brooklyn. In fact, there was a movie theater right next to a mosque, and this is in a neighborhood called Little Beirut, or Beirut as a. It's kind of like a. Uh, it's that's not the actual name, but people call it that because it has such a large population of Arab Muslims. They actually tried to buy out the neighborhood and turn it into an addition to their mosque. High love and light. But getting back to my point, I just think that these people need to present evidence that what ISIS did or is doing still is not Islamic. What did they do that is not Islamic, or what did Al Qaeda do, or Boko Haram, or Lashkar-e Taiba? What did any of these groups do that is at variance with what Muhammad preached? And the answer is not much. You could say that Baghdadi taking three of his children, supposedly he detonated a suicide vest that killed him and his three children. So killing his children, of course, that's something that Muhammad didn't do. So you could say at the end of his life, he did something that was un-Islamic or that was non-Muslim. But that's not what most people would condemn him for, and that's not the reason that ISIS is the subject of criticism, even from other jihadist groups like Al Qaeda. So, excluding that, and I'll grant you that that is doesn't have much precedence. Uh, Killing yourself along with three of your children, and I think he has seven or had seven children, so he wound up killing almost half of the children that he had with several wives. But putting that aside, um, I heard that he died about the ninth time. Yeah, there have been a bunch of rumors reporting his death prematurely, and even Russia. I think Russia likes to use this as propaganda to say that they're doing the real heavy lifting in terms of ISIS, despite the fact that most of the gains against ISIS have been done by the United States, its allies, its Kurdish and Arab allies, and the Iraqi and Syrian. Uh, to a lesser extent, the Syrian government has made some contribution, but Russia likes to propagandize, and so they've claimed to kill. They had claimed to kill Baghdadi earlier this year, but those were erroneous reports. But of course, this is um, if Baghdadi did have 9 lives, this was obviously his last, because he's dead, and by all accounts. So yeah, putting that aside, that one action, what did Baghdadi and his followers do that was not Islamic? The idea of um, the idea the idea of sex slavery, obviously I've demonstrated in my videos where we go through the verses how sex slavery is condoned. In fact, that phrase, those whom your right hand possess, that's even though it's cryptic today, for someone reading the Quran today, it might sound like a cryptic reference. That's an explicit reference to women that you captured as slaves and act as sex slaves. Uh, so it obviously the Yazidi women who were taken as sex slaves and the American female, um, the American woman, a journalist who was taken as a slave, or aid worker rather, that was condoned by the Quran, obviously. So there was nothing saying, and in fact, Muhammad repeatedly tells you that you can take non-Muslim women as slaves. So that is obviously not un-Islamic. So what Baghdadi was doing there was sanctioned by the Quran and by the Hadith, and murdering people who were not Muslim is obviously not un-Islamic because Muhammad did that repeatedly. So ISIS uh, attacking concert goers in France and slaughtering them and torturing them, that was obviously something that Muhammad not only condoned, but he encouraged and he practiced himself. Of course, he himself beheaded hundreds of Jewish tribes after they surrendered to his forces. So killing non-Muslims is obviously something that's sanctioned by the Quran. So ISIS was not, and Baghdadi weren't being un-Islamic there. So the sex slavery, the warfare against non-Muslims, those are obviously sanctioned. There's nothing that he did that was not sanctioned. What else? He destroyed historic relics in Palmyra in Syria, and this is something that Muslims are repeatedly enjoined to do. And in fact, in Robert Spencer's book, which I've mentioned a lot because it's a very good history, the history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. In that book, he describes in detail all of the Hindu temples and idols that were destroyed. All of them, almost all of them, were destroyed in the initial Muslims invasions of Hindustan or India, what's the Indian subcontinent, what's now Pakistan and India. All of these things were destroyed, and the Muslims, of course, waged war against their religious practices. They attacked the Sikhs, and several of the Sikh gurus, I forget how many, but several of the Sikh gurus were martyred by Muslims. And one of the most brutal Muslim rulers, and this is described in detail in Robert Spencer's book, Aurangzeb, he committed an enormous amount of atrocities and pillaging of non-Muslim holy sites. So the sex slavery, the warfare and atrocities committed against non-Muslims, the destruction of historic relics and artifacts, just like Al Qaeda and the Taliban, or the Taliban rather, destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. These are all sanctioned and encouraged within Islam, and they take place within an Islamic framework. Even some of the more outrageous, or even some of the some of the more outrageous actions that attracted a lot of publicity. For example, the immolation of the Jordanian pilot who was shot down and crashed in ISIS territory, him being burned alive, even that has its roots in the actions of Muhammad. So Muhammad, there's in Islamic tradition a story of Muhammad taking someone who he captured and wanting to steal his gold and his treasure, but he won't tell him where it is. So he has several of his cronies hold him down and then set a fire on top of his chest so that he'll confess. And after he's tortured, he confesses and then is dismembered and killed. So even that that instance of a Jordanian pilot being set on fire and burning to death, this is something that has grounding in Islamic tradition and in something that Muhammad ostensibly did himself. So even the most outrageous, barbaric thing you could accuse ISIS of, it has its roots in Islam and in the actions of Muhammad. So uh, there's not much you can say to rebut the assertion that the Islamic State was Islamic. It's self-evident if you've actually read the Quran and you're aware of Islamic literature and the biography of Muhammad himself, you'll understand that what Baghdadi was doing wasn't that much of a departure from what Muhammad did. So whether or not you think he had the authority to declare himself caliph, now that is, I think he was on shakier ground there because he tried to appropriate all of the symbology of the early Muslim empire, and a lot of Muslims, particularly Salafis and Wahhabis, people who want to turn the clock back, they like to lionize Muhammad and his early followers, his companions, and the early days of the Islamic Empire. And he tried to appropriate that. So, for example, when he made his speech, his speech in Mosul after the Islamic State actually started to cohere and take over large stretches of Iraq and Syria. So he made the speech in a mosque in Mosul in the black turban and the black garb, and this is symbolic of someone who claims patrilineal descent from Muhammad. So this was his opening gambit to say, I am a direct descendant of Muhammad, and therefore I have the right to declare myself to be caliph. And he even carried around a miswak, which is a toothpick, is kind of a toothpick-like implement made of twigs or a twig that you use to pick your teeth. And Muhammad actually a hadith is attributed to Muhammad, wherein he claims that he would have recommended this as obligatory. In other words, he would have put this in the Quran to use this because it's so useful of keeping your mouth clean and your breath fresh. He would have made this mandatory. That's how useful it is, but he didn't. There's even a hadith like that. And Baghdadi even carried that around. So he was really trying to connect himself directly to Muhammad. Now that part, understandably, that's a lot. That's a lot harder to justify the idea that he is by through some sort of hereditary, some sort of inheritance, that he's connected directly to Muhammad, because a lot of Muslims love to claim to be descended from Muhammad. So when you see these sheiks wearing black turbans, things like that, they like to claim that they're carrying on the traditions of Muhammad and practicing Islam as it was intended. So that I could understand people saying that that's a bit of an uh, that's a bit hard to justify, and it was used. These trappings were used in order to cement his rule, to kind of get more allegiance, especially when ISIS or proto ISIS broke away from Al Qaeda, from Jabhat al Nusra in Syria. This was trying to get Muslims to realize that he's the true leader, especially in the wake of Osama bin Laden's death. Um, so that I can understand questions about that. You could say that's not really legitimate, that he's not really. But whether or not you think the caliphate itself was a legitimate declaration, there were a bunch of ulema that supposedly came out with rulings that this wasn't a legitimate caliphate. So it depends on where you think the caliphate ended. Of course, even Shia believe in the four rightly guided caliphs: um, Abu Bakr, Uthman, Omar, and Ali. That would have been the Rashidun Caliphate. And following that, after Ali was assassinated, you had the Abbasid Caliphate. And so this is when Shias basically say that was the end. Then the Abbasid Caliphate, and they were replaced by the Umayyad Caliphate. You may remember them from the Spanish. Um, they they were the last to be kicked out of Western Europe during the Reconquista. And then eventually you had the last caliphate, which was under the direction of the Ottomans, the Turks. And Muslims, a lot of Muslims don't even consider that to be a caliphate, because these weren't Arabs. These weren't real descendants of Muhammad. These were basically nomadic tribesmen or uh, herdsmen who came down from Central Asia, swept down and consolidated power, and eventually destroyed the Byzantine, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, and took over and formed the Ottoman Caliphate. Osman was the founder of that. So there are basically four different caliphates. That one ended in the 1920s, and that was the last major unification of the Ummah. But even that, there were a lot of Muslims, of course, who rejected that because they were Turks and they didn't consider that legitimate. But regardless of where you trace the end of the original caliphate, you can say that what Baghdadi did in terms of trying to govern all Muslims under his leadership is not the notion itself is not un-Islamic, even if he wasn't a legitimate caliph. That notion of a pan-Islamic ummah and a caliphate is deeply grounded. And in fact, you have tens of millions of Muslims who are eager to return to that. A lot of them basing their desires on a nostalgic view of what the original caliphate was like, and not considering the fact that Muslims themselves splintered apart in the wake of Muhammad's death, occasioning the Ridda Wars, which were the wars of apostasy. So Islam, as we know it, could have disappeared and was on the verge of disappearing because these groups could not cohere under the leadership of anyone but Muhammad. Muhammad was what was holding them together. Now, of course, the outcome of that was the establishment of of a caliphate and the expansion of Islam. But my point is, even back then, during this so-called halcyon age of Islam, you had people trying to murder each other over their own interpretation. So when Muhammad is mocking Jews and Christians, saying, on the resurrection day, Allah will be the judge of your disputes. In other words, you disagree over scripture. It's kind of an indictment of the Quran itself, because once Muhammad died, you had Muslims at war with one another over Islam. And it really is, without the threat of coercion, without the threat of violence, and the enticement of military victory. And this was essentially what ISIS was offering. Come build not only the promise of war booty. A lot of single men went there, but also single women who in Islam are looked down on, and they're, even if they're married, they're basically broodmares. Muhammad refers to them as tilth, that you plow. So a lot of them, even if they're in Western countries, are treated like that. They came to Syria and Iraq in order to participate in this experiment, this project, where they would gain some kind of glory, and they would be part of a pan-Islamic state. So, I mean, without that carrot of military victory and glory and expansion and the threat of coercion, if you leave Islam, you're under the penalty of death. Without those two things, Islam would implode upon itself. And even as it is, Islam is declining precipitously. That more people abandon Islam, many of them quietly, because it's easier that way. But some of them publicly. There's even a campaign, "Okay Without Allah," I think, a Twitter or hashtag campaign. So there are more Muslims leaving Islam than there are so-called converts or people adopting Islam. And even the converts, 2/3 of them, at least in the West, eventually migrate away and leave once they understand what the religion is about. So you need those two things, and that was part of the appeal of the Islamic State. It was an enticement to people to come there to kill and to conquer and to become a hero. And of course, that's not what ultimately happened. After a brief 4-year period, a lot of these people were killed. They were imprisoned. They were murdered by rival jihadists. So the promise of Islam versus the reality of Islam, there's a huge disparity there. ISIS soldiers were being defeated, therefore ISIS brides had to be recruited. Yeah, well, one of the reason, and this is also how ISIS was very Islamic, was polygamy is, in some ways, polygamy is the bedrock of Islam, because you need more Muslims, especially if you're losing them in war or people are leaving the religion. You need more Muslims. You need to be constantly reproducing Muslims. And Islam itself was seeded within this environment. Like I said, after the first decade or so of peaceful but not unproductive proselytizing, Muhammad started to attack. So Islam was generated within an environment of warfare and death, and polygamy was used as a way to maintain the stability of Islamic society. And that was one of the justifications he used because of all the men being killed. You needed polygamy. And that was something that ISIS also utilized. And in that way, again, they were very much grounded in the Quran. And Osama bin Laden, there's a great book called The Al Qaeda Reader by Raymond Ibrahim. And he's an expert on these issues. And he did something called the Al Qaeda Reader, where he actually analyzed the letters from Al Qaeda leaders Osama bin Laden, Ayman al Zawahiri, Adam Gaddan, the American from California, the leaders and the spokespeople for ISIS, and actually analyzed them. And it's a very fascinating book. But one of the things about Osama bin Laden, if you read about his letters and his early history, and before he was a jihadist, he was married to multiple women, I think. And if you read about his life at that point, he actually said polygamy was more of a duty incumbent upon Muslims than jihad. So if you can imagine Osama bin Laden, who's probably the most famous jihadist in contemporary history, definitely over the past 2 decades, 2.5 decades or so, he thought polygamy was even more essential than jihad. And it makes sense when you actually look at this critically, because without the idea of polygamy, of plural marriage, of taking women as sex slaves, the fund the fundamental nature of Islamic society begins to erode. You just need this continuous supply. And I don't want to I don't want to get on a tangent here, but right now I'm reading a great book called a great book by V.S. Nepal, who wrote a book called Among the Believers. And this was a book that I read years ago, where he visits 4 non-Arab countries that are 4 non-Arab Islamic countries: Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Iran, at the turn of the 1970s. So when things like the Islamic Revolution were brewing, when the American embassy in Pakistan was being attacked, and American members of the American consulate were being killed, and things were also happening in Malaysia and Indonesia as well. He basically, it's a travelogue and a chronicle of his experiences there, and what they show about these nations, these non-Arab nations, and their approach to Islam. And it's really fascinating, because in 1998 he came back to those same countries and wrote a sequel called Beyond Belief, and that's the sequel I'm reading right now. And he has a great observation about the effect of polygamy, in this case in Indonesia, which is the first country he goes to, or returns to rather. And he just describes how it destroyed so much of society. You have these broken families, especially when a man leaves his wife, and broken marriages. And that's the result. That's the result of a religion that devalues marriage, and condones divorce and polygamy and all of these horrible things. So Beyond Belief, that's the name of the book. I would recommend that, and Among the Believers. And it's funny, in Among the Believers, he calls Islam I think at one point he refers to Islam. Not he doesn't use the Islam exactly, but what's happening, he calls it the I think he calls it the Malaysian disease. And it really is. When you look at, even today, you look at Zakir Naik. Where did he flee to? It was Malaysia. Where was the 9/11 plot hatched? It was in Malaysia. And Malaysia is a perfect example. You have a predominantly, you have just like a plurality, not even a majority, but a plurality of Muslim Malays who are, you have a bunch of Muslim Malays who have political control of society, but all of the productivity is in the Chinese, the Indian, the non-Muslim minorities. And they basically drive society. They're the only reason Malaysia's a stable society to the extent that it is, and somewhat successful, at least in comparison to other Muslim countries. But it's not because of Islam itself. And one of the great things is that in places like particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, you have a huge revival going on. You have lots of Muslim people coming to Christ. And if you follow the Arabian Prophet or Rob Christian or these other Christian apologetics channels who do live streams, and you go to their live streams, you see tons of these people who presumably were Muslim at one point who say, they found Jesus. So it's unfortunate. V.S. Nepal is deceased. He died recently, I think maybe a year or two ago. I'm not sure, but he died recently. But it would have been great if he had lived to come back maybe in 2000. He wouldn't have been able to, he wouldn't be alive for another 20 years, but maybe like in 2024 or 26, if he returned to these countries and found them to be, mostly Christian. So, I mean, that would be great. But there's definitely revivals going on in places like Malaysia and Indonesia and Iran, particularly. Unfortunately, I mean, Pakistan has been harder to crack because it's such a retrograde, just wicked society. But the other countries that he profiled are actually having pretty big Christian revivals within, which is a good sign. But that tangent aside, I just wanted to focus a little bit on Baghdadi and just show that what he did was completely consonant with Islam. Like I said, except for the very last actions where he killed his children in a suicide bombing. But aside from that, there was nothing in his life that contradicted Islam or the actions of Muhammad. Yeah, in Europe, it's interesting. In Europe, because of the disastrous decisions of Angela Merkel, they're having just real problems. But on the other hand, I mean, who knows? Maybe bringing them into Europe, they might actually be exposed to the Bible, which wouldn't have taken place in their home countries. So, I mean, you really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the destruction of Constantinople was horrific, but it allowed all of the Greek speakers the people who could read Greek, to go into Europe, and it led, in some ways, it led to the Reformation, being able to understand the original language in which the New Testament was written. So you can't really say what's going to happen in the future right now, but yeah, it looks bad. But like I said, there's nothing that you can say about ISIS or Al Qaeda or Baghdadi or Zawahiri that they did that is really, really flies against Islam or contradicts Muhammad. It's not really it's not really a persuasive argument, especially when you consider the fact that Baghdadi, this was a guy who had a PhD in Quranic recitation. So, who do you think has a better idea of what the Quran says? Someone who has a PhD in Quranic recitation and whose father was actually an Islamic teacher, and presumably this was someone who recited the Quran as an 8 and 9 year old. So, who do you think has a better idea of what Islam teaches and what Islam is about? Someone who has a PhD in Quranic recitation and has spent his entire life reading the Quran in its original language, which it's not the original, but in clear Arabic, in Arabic, an Arabic Quran is familiar with that. Do you think who knows more about Islam and its precepts, that guy or Rachel Maddow or the people who write for the New York Times, the op-ed board of the New York Times? Uh, so who has a better idea with that? This is why I have to scratch my head whenever I see people saying, "Oh, this is not Islamic and this is not," and the people saying that aren't. It's not the head of Al Azhar University. It's not someone who you would go to if you actually wanted to know what the Quran said. It's always, an anchor on MSNBC or some gender studies major at Brown. Like, why, why would these people know more about Islam than people who are immersed in Islam and have lived with Islam their entire life? Why would they know more about the Quran than someone who did a literal degree in Quranic studies? I mean, I've read the Quran and I'm doing a series on the Quran, but I'm not going to pretend that I know as much about the Quran as the late Mr. Baghdadi did, or that Ayman al-Zawahiri does. But I certainly know more than the people who are spouting off, the talking heads spouting off and saying that what ISIS does is not Islamic. That does not make any sense. Well, Baghdadi has met his maker, who isn't Allah. I'm sure he was shocked to discover that, but onward.